Good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Michael Kulma, and I'm the head of programs and communications here at International House. I'm grateful to see so many people here this evening, and I'm delighted to introduce tonight's program on the Doomsday Clock. Before we get started with the program and discussion, I want to express a few notes of thank you. First, a shout out to our team here at International House, Jocelyn and all the interns who help us to put these programs together. I want to thank our great partners at the Bulletin for agreeing to work together with us on tonight's program. And I, of course, want to thank our speakers and moderator for joining us tonight to share their insights and their inquiries. Tonight's program is one of many held annually by International House as part of our Global Voices Lecture Series programming. The Global Voices Lecture Series hosts prominent speakers, roundtable discussion groups, and special interest conferences and seminars. As a part of this program, leading figures from the world stage come to share their thoughts and exchange ideas with students and members of Chicago's civic community on major issues facing the country and the world. Tonight's program fits perfectly with that Global Voices description. From the day International House opened its doors over 91 years ago, our mission has been to promote cross-cultural understanding, mutual respect, and friendship among international students, scholars, and the Chicagoland community. That mission is made manifest through programs like tonight's, and that mission guides the work of the 15 other international houses around the world. So what exactly is the Doomsday Clock? The Doomsday Clock is a design, and we'll learn much more about it than I'm about to say, but the Doomsday Clock is a design created in 1947 by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists to spread public awareness about the fragile state of our world and our own contributions to the destruction of our home. When the clock was created, nuclear weapons stood as the newly created front and center danger to humanity. Over the years, new threats have been added to the conversation, including issues such as climate change and disruptive technologies. Every year, the Bulletin updates the timing of the clock to remind us of the perils we must address to survive. On January 23rd of this year, the clock time was revealed, and we found ourselves at the same time as last year, 90 seconds to midnight. This time is flagged as a moment of historic danger, and we are now left with the question of how to collectively point ourselves in a better direction. This is just a teaser for the conversation you're going to hear over the course of the next hour plus. I'm delighted to now introduce tonight's speakers, who will dive deeper into the clock and the issues, challenging each other and challenging each of us to think differently about the threats we face. First, we have Rachel Bronson, who's sitting in the middle. Rachel is the president and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Next, we have Daniel Holz at my far left. Daniel is the chair of the Science and Security Board of the Bulletin, and he's a UChicago Professor of Physics, Astronomy and Astrophysics, the Enrico Fermi Institute, and the Kavli Institute for Cosmological Physics. And finally, we have our moderator, Neil Steinberg. Neil is a daily news columnist at the Chicago Sun-Times, where he has been on staff since 1987. If you happen to have caught Neil's column on the clock and this program a few weeks back in the Sun-Times, you'll know that Neil brings a fresh and very penetrating perspective to these issues. And we're looking forward to seeing where he leads us tonight. Neil, over to you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, everyone, for coming out tonight. I was wondering what kind of people were going to come out to talk about Doomsday. Just as I was wondering why they asked me. I think as a daily journalist, they figure I know something about doom. And I'm going to try to talk as little as possible because Dr. Bronson and Professor Holz are really the experts. And I want to kick off the conversation by sort of setting some definitions, maybe. We talk about Armageddon and atomic disaster. What are we talking about? What's the reality of it? You know, as someone who knows history, there were 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. They were terrible loss of life. There were in-air hydrogen bomb tests in the 50s. If China attacked us or we attacked Russia, if some of these exchanges happened, would it really be the end of the world, or would it just be a nasty period like previous nasty periods we had? What are the stakes that we're talking about, that we're trying to avoid here tonight and with your Doomsday Clock and publication?
Great, thank you. Thanks for the question. Thanks to International House for having us tonight. Thanks for Michael, who reached out to host the program. It's good to see everybody out here tonight. I want to make sure my microphone okay. You all in the back in here? Great. It's a great question. What is midnight, especially as we add new threats? What is the apocalypse? What we talk about life, the end of life on Earth as we know it, which actually is also open for debate on what that is. But by and large, we truly mean the end of life as we know it. So it's made more obvious through nuclear weapons. It's not the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki that is that's an omen of what could come. It's really about a strategic nuclear exchange that would wipe out millions and tens of millions, if not billions of people. That is actually quite possible. And the kind of exchange that also leads to what we know of as nuclear winter, which is after the exchange and all the soot in the atmosphere, the devastation of food crops and all that, the ability to sustain life on Earth.
And the science is there. This is not conjecture on your part. This is what people, having studied the issue, are confident would happen if such an exchange happened.
Yeah, and even backing up, so we can get right into it, which is, when I talk about a strategic exchange, let's just take a moment and maybe drill into why the war in Ukraine makes us so nervous and why we did last year move it from 100 seconds to midnight to 90 seconds to midnight, really focusing on the war in Ukraine is all of the war games that are played that look at, well, what if nuclear weapons are used? They always end up with a tit-for-tat exchange that runs right up the nuclear escalation ladder to a full-on nuclear exchange. And so we don't think there's any reason to believe that if you use a tactical nuclear weapon or a weapon the size of what were dropped in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that it would stop there. There's nothing that gives us confidence in that. And I want to be really clear because we're kind of jumping into the middle of the conversation, but it is actually quite important to what we're talking about, which is right now there is actually a debate within strategic circles about whether or not to invest in smaller nuclear weapons. And smaller, they mean like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but they can go even smaller than that because the Russians are doing that. And the Russians are training their militaries to operate with a limited nuclear use device. So they are training as if they could use a small nuclear weapon to deter the United States. So for the United States, there's a big investment and strategic discussion of we need to be able to meet them at that level, because if they use a smaller yield nuclear weapon, we wouldn't respond with a larger one, right? And so we need something to deter them from using that. All of this to say, and we're going to get into this conversation tonight, there is, like no time since maybe the 80s, a very active conversation right now about nuclear strategies, the size of nuclear weapons, and how this relates to your question of what Armageddon looks like. It's very easy, and I would be the first one to say it's hard to imagine the U.S. and the Soviet Union just launching their full-on arsenals. The real scary bit is what happens if smaller tactical nuclear weapons are used, and how quickly do we escalate? And then the consequences of that, which are also the same kinds of consequences if you had a exchange between like India and Pakistan. So I'll stop there.
Professor Holz, I want to draw you into the conversation. You're on the security board, Science and Security Board of the Bulletin. Isn't one purpose of the doomsday scenario to counterbalance that temptation to use small nuclear devices? In other words, you want people to keep in mind that you can't be a little pregnant, and that once this is unleashed, that the scenario ramps up very quickly.
Yeah, so that's right. So first, let me just say it's great to be here, and I've come to many events at International House. I was a graduate student here, so it's very exciting to be on the other side. Anyway, so that's mutually assured destruction. This idea that it would be completely insane to, and when you ask what's doomsday, that's a very clear doomsday. Mm-hmm. If we use all the weapons we have, all major cities are annihilated, billions of people are gone. Nuclear winter means the food supply collapses. We're no longer sitting here having polite conversation. That's really the end of civilization as we know it, and I think that's very clear. It might not mean that every single human being is dead, but it's, whether there's any quality of life, and it's not a small pause. It's not a few years and we rebuild. It's in the history of civilization, it's a complete reset to zero. So that's kind of what we have in mind. So a full exchange would do that. There's this idea that no one would ever push the button to do that, of course, and none of us would push that. I mean, there's no point. Like, that's it. That's the end. However, I think one of the major concerns is that you could end up in a situation where someone ends up pushing the button because you just kind of, it's like by mistake, miscalculation. You kind of bluff. Like, we have leaders now that are making bluffs. In Ukraine, we've had Russia say, back off, or we might have to use one of our weapons. And when you have people saying that, what happens next? That's what Rachel is saying. That sounds pretty ominous.
You said no one would do that, and that kind of gave me a shiver, because I think if we had to describe the past half decade, we're in a time where things where you never thought would ever happen are happening on a pretty regular basis.
That's right.
And I, as a communicator and as an educator, I want to hear what your thoughts are, and you too as well, Dr. Bronson. Global warming has become such to the fray as an existential threat facing the world. The Bulletin has included that because you're in the disaster avoidance business. But do you worry, that you're going to dilute your important message about, people aren't going to worry about Armageddon because they're worried about everything burning down right now? And B, do you see the way people are avoidant and living in their own fantasy worlds and not doing even small steps because they cost money? Does that make you worry that the message of the care we need to have on the planet with both climate change and nuclear arms is not getting through to people?
Well, so all of those are interesting points. So for climate change, we've been talking about, I think the first, it was on the cover of an issue in '78 of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, our journal, and it's been part of the clock setting since 2007. So that's definitely something we care about. We care about it in two ways. One is that climate change is happening. It's what we're talking about, what we're concerned about is not what we're experiencing now, which is the last year was the hottest on record. There's fires, there's crazy flooding, including in California right now. I mean, there are these extreme climate events happening with regularity. That's not what we worry about. That was expected. What we worry about is what's going to happen 10 years from now, 20 years, 30 years, because all the models say this is just the beginning and it's going to get much, much worse. That's what we worry about. It's still perhaps, depending on how what is done in terms of fossil fuel emission, perhaps not to the stage where human beings can't live on the Earth. We think that's a ways away, but it will change the world as we know it, for sure, in terms of refugee crises, in terms of food supply, in terms of what is habitable, people are going to have to move, cities are going to be flooded. All of this is going to happen. It's just a question of degree. What we're trying to do now is control the worst aspects in the coming decades. So that's one aspect, and that's bad enough. I mean, the impact on civilization will be severe, but there's this other aspect which I think is even more concerning, personally, which is that it's what we call a threat multiplier. You're destabilizing the world. I mean, we've had relatively minor refugee crises already all over the world, and they're very disruptive. You look at what happens to Europe because of Syria, it's really had impact. We're talking 10 or 100 times more easily just because regions of the earth you can't live there. You can't be out during the day. It's too hot to live. And so as those people move, as food becomes scarce, as clean water becomes scarce, that's going to be destabilizing. Now you have states that are starting to fight for resources. The probability of things escalating into war goes way up. The probability of things escalating into nuclear war goes way up. And it just becomes much more unstable. That's not a world we want to live in. And that's our concern.
Dr. Bronson, you included AI relatively recently. And I remember looking at that and thinking, are they leaping from the blocks on this one? I mean, obviously some people think it's an existential threat. Some people think it's a copyright issue. Can you talk a bit about the decision to include that? Did you worry again that you were being premature, or do you really think that this is what's going to be launching the nukes that get us?
Yeah. So I think instead of going through like a list of doomy things that we should all be terrified about, which is certainly a direction we can go, I think that and I'll bring this up to the AI question. I think what is really important about the clock, first of all, is in this case where we are now in the current moment, I think many of us, if not most of us, think things really aren't going in the right direction. And the clock is hopefully reflecting that we're not crazy. If you look over throughout history, it is a very dangerous time. It's very unstable. Technology is moving very quickly. We don't have rules to govern it. And we're not acting, our leaders aren't keeping us safe. And so that's like the message of that. We have moved the hands of the doomsday clock back. In fact, we've moved them back in the most dangerous of times. So if you go back and you look at the time on the doomsday clock and you go back to 62, 63, you'll actually see we move it away from midnight, which makes no sense, right? When it's the Cuban Missile Crisis. So dangerous. Our editors write from the preface of that issue, like I'm planning to file this intro. I don't know if there'll be anything to land on. Like, truly, very worried about it. But what happens immediately thereafter is leaders were so spooked that they put in place a raft of arms control agreements and confidence-building measures because they were so terrified by what they had just confronted. And in fact, it becomes the beginning of what can be referred to as a golden age of arms control and arms control agreements, kind of the 70s through 2010, even though there was certainly dangerous times in there, but there was a set of agreements and commitments. So we can move it back, and we can move it back during dangerous times. And that's the optimistic message of this, is to say, yes, it's dangerous. Yes, we believe it's more dangerous than even in the height of the Cold War. Great discussion that we could have. And that we're not crazy to think that way, that we believe when you look at the advancement of technology. So the question on AI is, it comes out of what is this doomsday clock, right? What is it measuring? And is it measuring nuclear risk, or is it measuring existential threat? And if you go back in the archives of the Bulletin, which I've done, this is a debate that they are having. They are having it throughout the decades of what is this? Is it existential threat or nuclear risk? At the magazine and now on our website, we're reporting on this. And it's really about science's advancement. It doesn't really matter until you get to the 90s and early 2000s. And basically, when you get to the point of you can no longer answer the question, is humanity safer or at greater risk, by only focusing on nuclear weapons, because that existential threat, you can't answer it anymore without including climate. And so that's why in 2009, I think, we included climate change finally. Like, we answered that debate of what are we? Are we a harbinger of existential risk, or are we describing nuclear risk? That we are an organization focused on existential risk. And now, very early on, because we are based on the science and because we're thinking about the political and ethical implications of the science, we were early to declaring climate change an existential risk. And it's our belief that that is actually helpful in talking about and framing climate, that the science was showing us, and we reported, as Daniel said, by 78, we had answered the question with a cover story saying, is mankind changing the climate? And you open it and said, we say yes, basically. So that leads us up to like where we are now. And we think about these two existential threats, nuclear risk and climate change. Does it dilute the message? I don't know. It's just, we have to be able to hold both of those in our heads and understand what the challenges are. But it makes, we have this bucket of disruptive technologies that we keep our eye on because they intersect, as Daniel said, as threat multipliers, but also to see like what's on the horizon and what's coming. And that's why, and we've been doing a lot on biosecurity and biosafety and biorisk. But on AI, what makes it so fascinating is for a number of years, I always said, like, you know, when we're talking about AI, if we're talking about driverless cars, we're not that interested. It's important. I'm kind of interested in it. But like as an institution and organization, we're not. But if it's about humans changing the narrative or something more than that, then we get pretty interested. And so when the recent kind of breakthroughs in ChatGPT came through, and you have this surge right now, like AI having their Oppenheimer moment, if you will, like grappling with the consequences, the leaders grappling with the consequences. And many in that realm are saying it's existential. Right. Very early, we were like, this is very familiar to us and we should listen. If the leaders of the technology are telling us we need to be better regulated, we need to be governed, and it's existential, let's, you know, for us, we're pretty interested now. So I think where we are, and Daniel can speak to the debates that we had internally as a board, we're not yet convinced that it's existential, actually. We're paying a whole lot of attention to those who are saying it is. Daniel has them come into his class to speak. We're not convinced yet that it is, or rather that it's not just a tool that individuals still have control over, but they're saying that it is. So we're paying attention, and what we did in the clock statement, and I hope you'll go and read it, that accompanies the time, as we said, regardless, it has the potential to be really dangerous.
There is a very real human tendency that when things are new, to sort of catastrophize them. 120 years ago, when teddy bears were introduced, ministers went into their pulpits and said that girls are abandoning their baby dolls and they're picking up these bears and they're not going to have kids anymore. And, you know, and I'm not putting
this isn't new. I mean, that's not fair because AI has been growing for decades, and so go ahead.
Yeah, let me just say a couple points, kind of amplifying what Rachel just said. And I think, you know, the Bulletin, kind of the way it originated was by scientists in the Manhattan Project and people like Oppenheimer and Einstein saying, we're terrified of this new technology. At that point, there had been Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That was it for weapons. There was no Cold War. No one else, no other nation had weapons. Those are fission weapons. So there were no fusion bombs, which are 1,000 times more powerful. It was really early days. And then the scientists got together, created the Bulletin to alert the public and said, we're terrified. This is the way this might go. There might be a Cold War. These weapons are going to get, you know, much more powerful. There are going to be thousands of them. If they're all used, it's over. And unless we change our way of thinking, if we have another world war using weapons. But this was very early. The scientists, because they knew the technology, knew where things could go. They knew that fusion bombs were possible. You know, it would probably be made. They could anticipate all this, and they said, we're terrified. We think the public and policymakers should be terrified and should be careful. That was their message. Now, for what it's worth, we have people in the AI community saying, these are people who have worked on it for decades. This is their entire career. They've built these things. They're now looking at the pace of progress. They're extrapolating out. They're seeing this exponential development, and they're saying, some of them, terrified, this is really bad, this is out of control, and it could be existential. And so you could say, well, we should just ignore the scientists. What's the, they know. But this is not an alarmist group. It's really in their own interests, to just continue. The science is amazing. Now they're kind of finally seeing the fruits of decades of effort. And yet, quite a few of them are stepping back, saying, no, maybe we've let the genie out of the bottle. So that's, so that's one aspect. And let me just do one other thing, which I think, on the Bulletin, we've had lots of discussions. We're not, I would say, we're certainly not uniformly convinced that AI in and of itself will take over the world and, enslave us and it's all over. Like, that's not, it's unclear. There's just a lot of extrapolation. It's unclear where things will go. But some things are clear. Something that the Bulletin has been worried about for many years is misinformation and disinformation, which we think of as an existential threat in the sense not that social media will wipe out all of humanity directly, but that social media kind of amplifies these messages. We all know that now it's very hard to know what's real, that you end up with large groups of people believing things that are false. The way this will evolve is it becomes very hard to know what the truth is. Is there a real world out there? What's truly happening? Is climate change happening? If you can't have kind of uniform, if we can't all agree on the basic facts, yes, last year was the hottest year on record, but if somehow we just can't agree on that anymore, then it's very hard to address. And AI, for sure, makes disinformation, it kind of turbocharges it. And
You've been doing this for a number of years, both of you. How would you gauge this year's reaction to previous years? Do you feel drowned out, shouted down, misunderstood, or do you feel, I saw a lot of echoes of your announcement over the past few weeks, so it seemed to me that your message was getting across. I'm wondering how it seems to you.
Yeah, I've worked in a number of think tanks over the years and kind of follow the kind of reactions. I've never seen anything like the Doomsday Clock. I mean, it is extraordinary that we announced the time. So we do take it very seriously. We announced that it does go around the world. It stops the news cycle. I mean, you'd have a better sense of that, but the reaction is always very dramatic. Now, but what we've been working on, we were just talking about this morning, is that for us, it's not just the time. The time's important, but then, right, like what do we do with it? Why did we set the time where we did? What's important in there? So what we take some gratification in is we spend a lot of time, certainly, first of all, like setting the scene of like what the messages are behind the setting of the time, and then make it available to people if they want to know more, right? We have that there is a statement that Daniel and his colleagues work on like for weeks to put it together to be concise and kind of get out into the world. So we've seen a strong, extremely strong uptake this year and a conversation, and often people will ask, like, well, what do you want like to come from this? And truly, I think, first of all, to recognize the Doomsday Clock is an entrance ramp. And I visualize it that way. It's an entrance ramp into very hard and complicated subjects that are designed to keep the public out. Like, it's hard to talk about nuclear weapons. It's hard to talk about AI. These are created communities that are designed to keep the public out, and we need the public to get engaged. So the Doomsday Clock becomes a conversation of, like, they set it at 90 seconds to midnight. And it's easy to dismiss it, because I know we see it all the time. But what we hope happens is people are like, well, did they get it right? So What time do you think it should be? Should it be closer to midnight? We get tons of emails about that. Should it be further away from midnight? And why? What would you set it at? Why would you set it there? And also, what would you include to look at? Like, you know, we have biorisks and AI. Would you not put those in? That's just an interesting question of why wouldn't you? Like, why do we include it and you wouldn't? Or, you know, back in the day, people went to put climate change in. We were very early to recognize it as climate change. So we feel pretty good about what we said. We mean it. But the debate and the conversation and the ability to talk about it is most important. So, and I'll stop here, like when I get emails like from teachers to say, I had students in here, we were talking about it, it's not an actual clock, but it's a metaphor, and we started talking about some of the issues in there. That's ultimately what we want to have happen.
As a communicator, I must say, at first I was disappointed when it was the same. It was 90 seconds to midnight last year, it was 90 seconds this year. I'm thinking, that's a lost opportunity because things should be either better or worse. And we've got the war in Gaza, and we've got different things, and it just, to come out and go, it's the same, and then I decided it was probably bold because, I mean, journalism is a kabuki. We're a stylized form where we go through, you know, the warning is like a snapped fan. We're very much big into warning. In fact, we were talking before this, there was, I mean, the media does some astoundingly terrible things, and even though the Washington Post today, if you read it, there was a headline that just killed me, and the headline was, "Scientists start to worry about moon shrinking." And I knew when I read, the moon is shrinking a foot every million years because of its cooling. And I knew before I read it, and I read the entire story because I knew there were no scientists worrying about that. That was just the headline. What they were doing is they were studying it. And the harm that could come from this is if we have a base there, there could be an earthquake from the shrinking moon, which in the list of things I'm worried about is way down there. So, you know, what I want to talk to you about is that the media, you know, here is something which is, you know, life or death for humanity.
Every major nuclear state is investing in nuclear weapons as if they are usable, and their military postures are mirroring that. So there is a sense that, you know, we hear about what's going on in North Korea, we watch what's going on in Iran, and we watch in our own country, the United States is about to spend $1.8 trillion over the next 30 years in an entirely new nuclear arsenal. So this is our money that we are putting into it for some of the reasons that we kind of started with. So I think the reason there was such an interest, other than the cast was delightful, was that it kind of spoke to a moment. Now, what do we do with that moment? You are absolutely correct. The interest that we saw of just the movie and what are the connections to today, and is AI having its Oppenheimer moment, and what's going on with nuclear weapons, it did, it leveraged that interest, if you will. And that's where the Bulletin kind of wants to, we want people to come to us, not some of the more like wackadoodle places out there, but we want them to come to us and kind of follow the conversation. But it also gives new imagery. One of the biggest challenges we have, which is happily the images we have, right, are from 1945, that long ago. Not happily that we have those images, but that's how long ago the images are, right? They're old. And so there is a sense of bygone era. And that's what's so scary, right? Because when the public isn't paying attention is actually when all of this gets to go onto overdrive. And so the public is starting to pay attention again to these issues of nuclear weapons, and Oppenheimer has given them language, has given them imagery, has given them a sense of reference point. And so I would say, like, how many of you went to see the movie and you could walk out and you probably talked about it a little bit, right? And it wasn't, like, weird to talk about it. That's what people were talking about. So they legitimized the conversation. And so what can individuals do? You know, each issue area, obviously, there's different things that can be done. In climate, there's smaller things that can make a difference, and all of that's important. But just immediately when you said that, you know, honestly, I think our right now in the United States, so much of this public square is under assault. And you have to either be on this side or that side. And, I just imagine us being here, we're like keeping these walls up, and we're defining the space to say we can talk about serious issues, we can think about how we can make a contribution, and we can recognize that this isn't, that it's serious, it's important, and it's really hard. But if we can devote an evening to it and then think about, like, $1.8 trillion over the next 30 years, is that really necessary? And how can I stop that? What pieces of that in your own life, and where do you have that? Everyone has influence in some space to maybe question whether we really should be on that path. And so keeping these walls standing as they are, having these kinds of discussions, thinking about what part of these issues that you want to kind of get engaged with, all of that does roll up and into kind of positive activity. And I'll end it on this. Last year we had Hank Green, who is a science communicator, and he speaks to kind of current high schoolers very directly. And he said no one person is going to solve the problem, that the problem doesn't get solved without lots of people. So you have to pick your issues, figure out where you're going to get involved, and find others who share that interest.
And develop a way to communicate. I mean, my job, I put out a newspaper column, so I'm addressing everybody who can get their hands on the Sun-Times or address the website. And I'm trying, what's the point of telling people things, just to say you're a dupe following a fraud, that doesn't, no one's going to go, oh my God, yes, thank you. So you try to craft the message and say, even if we ignore facts, that doesn't mean the facts ignore us. And so it's a way to sort of draw them in with you and say, these are really important issues that we're facing, that even if we had people who cared more about the country than ourselves, and even people who were completely fact-based, we've been lucky to get to this point. And that's one thing it is in a way a negative thing, doomsday and this sort of thing. But I think there's a flip side to it that I wanted to at least mention while we have a moment. And we're going to get to questions. I didn't mention this, that the last 20 minutes or so, if you have questions, we're going to address that. So we're coming up to that point. And please, when you do, make them questions as opposed to speeches and things. And people, sometimes they start to talk and everyone else is sitting there going, where's the question in that? And so to me, this is also the flip side of this, is the preciousness of life. Because all these things are possible, that the climate, the whole earth that we love can change, and the trees will die, et cetera. And because these wars could be sparked unless we're careful, and maybe even if we are, I think they sort of show that we're, there's going to be an end for all of us. And hopefully it won't be this end, but just to be cognizant of the end and to do what you can and to be an active citizen and to be an aware person and to be someone who realizes that your time here is finite and precious. I think that that's something worth doing as well, even if I don't think that I'm going to affect the stockpile of nuclear weapons or how much carbon is emitted in the atmosphere.
Yeah. And I mean, you can say more, which is one of the things that has been hopeful over the past years is that, for example, in climate, the public really has started to have this kind of, it's sort of the public that's been pushing. As that awareness grows, then it's filtered up, and now, I think there's a lot more pressure on politicians to engage with these, and we can hope that there's progress. It's not, there's still lots, it's not solved, but at least it's really being discussed. Some fair fraction of people are taking it seriously and really trying. And I think, public engagement is a major part of that.
I was talking with a climate scientist on the Science and Security Board who's in India, and it was like, what can people do? And I was like, I think that, what the current climate scientists have done is, in some sense, I believe, they've kind of won the debate over whether climate change exists. We're all dealing with the weather, and we see it, the climate, we see what's happening with ice caps, we see what's happening with the oceans. But that was a decades-long battle that I think, based on what we're experiencing, but also the development of the science and the articulation of the scientists, that is, I would say, we're on the right side of that hump. But we weren't 10 years ago. I do have the sense that this generation of climate scientists has helped us win that battle. It's the next generation of scientists who now have to figure out how to reverse it. And it shouldn't have taken as long as it did. There were, as again, we were out saying it, decades ago, but there is still time to respond. There is a lot of innovation that needs to be done. And that's the challenge of this generation, the coming generation of scientists. And we were just talking about it, that we need to recognize that the scientists and those around us, that there are successes. These are really big and hard issues, and those successes should come earlier. But now we have to figure out, and so we highlight in the report the bright spot of the amount of funding that has gone into renewables this year. It's record-breaking. It's huge amounts of investments being invested in renewables across the globe. The challenge is we're still investing too much in fossil fuel, and we expect more to be coming online as the economies in the South really continue to industrialize. So it has to happen faster. It's not happening fast enough. But there are some bright spots in that, the seriousness of which we're taking these issues.
The hopeful paradigm I always point out is smoking. Because when I was in kindergarten, half of U.S. adults smoked, and it was this joyful, addictive part of their lives, and the problem was it killed them. And when this was first revealed, people just denied it. It's like, well, what the heck? And then it became a right, and there was this whole battle, and bit by bit it was fought, and now it's like 12% of American adults. And it's gone from something that everyone does everywhere to something like people are hidden and, off to the side in the rain doing it. And to me, it's because there's a weight and a momentum to reality, if you're reality-based. And that eventually, when this stuff is true, people, they fall in line because they don't want to die. And that,
Yeah, I think cigarettes is a very interesting example because, of course, there were decades where the tobacco companies fought that message.
Right.
And it successfully. And it was very hard, and there were special interests. And it was a very difficult battle.
People said no one's going to go to restaurants. Who's going to eat out?
Yeah, there was so
now
many
you can,
And it was so easy, and that was one of these things where, it takes a little while for you to see the effects. It's not, so it's a scientific thing. And the science was established way before it really kind of kicked into the public. And right now, like climate, it's exactly the same thing, except that the profits for the, fossil companies is astronomical, and those interests, it's really in their interest to muddy the discussion, to confuse what can be done, to say we can't do it too fast, let's slow it down, and we've seen a lot of that. The battle is not won. People now, we know climate is changing. I think that's pretty much established. In terms of the public, but there are a lot of things we can do that we're not doing. The technology is there. We could be moving faster. We could be investing better. We're still subsidizing fossil fuels. We're still building out fossil capability when we should have stopped that a long time ago. And I think, cigarette smoking is an example. Why would you it kills you, yet you do it? We're addicted to fossil fuels in a very similar way, and it's nice to have power, and civilization runs on power. It doesn't have to be fossil. We don't care where the electricity comes from. It's much healthier for us, not just for the planet, but just burning coal is so dirty. There's millions of deaths just from the pollution. It's just so much better for the planet if we move on. We're not getting there fast enough, and it's a similar story. And hopefully, we will get through, we'll transition, we'll decarbonize the world in terms of energy, and then we'll look back and we'll be able to say the same thing. Look at what happened with cigarettes. Now everyone knows they're bad, and we try to reduce our addiction. But,
well, it circles back to the Doomsday Clock, is I think advertising and communication is so important, because part of cigarettes were all those ads with people with the, smoking with the holes and things. And that's why, not to bring up another deadly subject with guns, whenever people talk about laws and things, I always say, we're not even ready for laws. We need advertisement. We need message out there about what the numbers are. and how you put your family at risk when you buy a gun, because it's been allowed, because of moneyed interest, to be turned into this constitutional right, this religious right. And it's very disconcerting to see the small, tiny practical steps, put a trigger lock on this, have some sort of commonplace limit where you can still buy tons of guns, it's just you can't do X or Y. And people, I just really think that part of this is to somehow reground people as concerned citizens, part of a country of similar concerned citizens. The line I cooked up with because of current political events, I said that the problem is that once you get into the practice of ignoring reality, the specifics of the reality being ignored, it doesn't matter. And so to me, I think part of what you're trying to do is to not reach the people who would come out on a Tuesday night to do this, but to reach other people and go, look, these are serious things. And your grandchildren are going to wish that you had paid attention to this. And that's a very hard message to get to people because they get into these frenzies. I'm wondering, Professor Holz, as a teacher, you see, not generations, but you see new crops of young people. Do they seem engaged? Does their choice of science? I mean, there's a lot of pure science where your gravitational waves and things. But do you see that that the current threats are directing the careers they're picking for themselves?
Yeah, I mean, so there's a range, but I have to say the teaching does make me hopeful, and so I've taught this Are We Doomed class a couple times. The previous time was in 2021. During the pandemic, and even then there was of course it was a pandemic, and things were just not looking great back then, and there was kind of a pall over the class, but students kind of fought through it. What can I do? But it was very hard to make the class hopeful, and this year, even though the Doomsday Clock is actually closer to midnight now than it was then, there is more hope. And I think part of that is because of, that you can see in the climate arena, there really are these points of light, like the price of renewables has dropped, and you can kind of see an endpoint where we all make it. And I think that's been incredibly invigorating. And also just, there's something about just having it be part of the community. Like it's now so broad. It's not just you seeing the end and no one else. It's like the whole world is aware that things aren't going well, and that's kind of the first step. When you get there and you can acknowledge that we have a problem, you can start working.
We should. I mean, to me, when you said that, I thought of. the fact that we have this problem at all was because Enrico Fermi, who lived here for a year, just close by, split the atom, and we mastered the subatomic particles and the whole structure of the universe, which is not necessarily an easy thing for a naked ape to do. And that if we could do that, maybe we could suck carbon out of the atmosphere or something, which is much more basic. When you think about it, we do have these enormous brains that if we put it to it, maybe we could do it.
Yeah. So I do think, and this is definitely one of the principles of the Bulletin, is that it's amazing what the human mind can accomplish, what this civilization has accomplished. And the only question here is, can it kind of be used for good? Is it for the betterment of civilization, or is it for the end of civilization? And it's not clear, which way things will go.
Within our lifetimes, 40 years ago, Motorola did an ad. They trotted out the first cell phone, which was 50 pounds and bolted in your car, and it said, "Every minute will be productive." Was the headline, and I thought, I don't want every minute productive. And I did one of my first columns and say, I called the cell phones a fad. So why would you want a phone in your car? That's off point. Questions? Are we getting? Anyone have anything we haven't? I hope this is sort of the thing. Yes, sir. Let's start with you. Just into the mic, if you could.
Thank you. First, I am a subscriber of the Chicago Sun-Times, the best newspaper in Chicago, and it's delivered to my door, and I actually read it as opposed to on the internet. So thank you, Neil. I read your column.
Thank you.
So my question is, does the Bulletin consider the personalities of the then or now leaders and major political figures and leaders that actually have the ability to push the button in their considerations of where we're at?
I think what we try to look at are actions rather than personalities, because personalities can be affected. The environment can affect what a personality brings to the decision making. This has come up a lot lately, as you can imagine. You know, what we move the clock on are really issues of global governance and whether we're investing in it or not. And so I go back to kind of 2016, 2017, and we had this discussion of whether to move the clock away from midnight and we decided not to right in January of 2016 because but we counted as, I'm getting to your question, but we counted as bright spots things like the Paris Climate Accords, which we knew that we were expected to sign on to but that was going to happen after our announcement. And the Iran, the JCPOA, or the Iran deal, that had been signed but not ratified. And so we called them out as bright spots, expecting to move the clock away from midnight the following year, when all of that we thought was helpful to global governance to manage the most dangerous issues of our day. And then we had a new president, Donald Trump, who had just been elected, and he was very clear that he was going to kill the Iran deal and pull us out of the... So we ended up not moving it away from midnight, but actually moved it towards midnight. And so is that a personality thing? Well, it's really a campaign promise, and we were pretty sure that he intended to do that and immediately did that, and we were moving the clock forward. So we try to look at actions, but as best we can. So in Ukraine, you could say, well, Vladimir Putin's a madman, and so we're going to move it towards... But the reason we moved it towards midnight is because he was literally threatening the use of nuclear weapons. They had attacked Zaporizhia, the nuclear power plant. He was threatening to use nuclear weapons. So personality or not, we were looking at kind of the statements and actions that he was undertaking and what kind of global governance, what were their commitments to global governance, the arms control agreements, so those are the things like we map out, because there are ways that we can kind of measure commitment to global governance. And so my big overarching kind of point on all this is all these issues, these are global challenges and they need global solutions. And what we've been seeing, I would say, from Donald Trump is a belief that let's pull out of any deal we have if it's not good enough, rather than, even if it's not ideal, how do we invest further and make it better? And so we try not to do personalities, but we try to point to actions that leaders take and how that maybe rolls up into the ability to manage the global challenges that we confront.
And maybe I can amplify one aspect of that, which is, for example, one of the things we're concerned about is right now the way decision-making works for nuclear weapons is there's a situation which we call sole authority and launch on warning. So what that means is the President of the United States has the sole authority to issue a launch, and once they effectively push the button, there's no checks and balances. It doesn't go to anyone else. The Supreme Court doesn't weigh in. No one else weighs in by law. I mean, there's a chain of command. It goes straight. The missiles are launched. Civilization is over. That's our system. Now, you should keep that in mind when you vote. That is the system. But what we can do as an organization is say, why would we do it that way? The most consequential decision that will ever be made in the history of civilization, we leave to one person. They're having a bad morning and they decide to push the button. Like, what? Why would we do that? Maybe we should change that. There were reasons to do that once upon a time, because there was this sense that to have a deterrent, you had to launch right away to guarantee that the missile. But those reasons went away decades ago. There's no reason for that urgency. We could be much more deliberate about it. And so maybe that's something we should consider and we should change. And that's something, for example, that you can have a discussion about. It doesn't, we don't have to get into the different personalities and, psychoanalyze. Just say, that's just not a good system, what we have now. Let's change it. And if we change it, maybe other nations will change it too, and the whole world will be in a better state.
There's also...
And then, let me just, on this point, because I think also if you go back and you look at our current statement, that was very interesting. If you go to the nuclear sidebar, so we have a kind of a subchapter on each of the areas, the Science and Security Board really debated exactly your question of how to kind of handle it. And they have a couple paragraphs in there which reminds the reader that during President Trump's tenure, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, came out and was basically saying that all decisions, if they kind of ratchet up to, needed to go through him. And they document that as concern for those in power about a particular leader. And the Science and Security Board wanted to point out that there's concerns and how dangerous that situation could be again, and to be thinking about that as we go out to vote. And so it's difficult. We're not taking a political stance on it, but that was just a reality of something that happened 4 years ago that gives us considerable concern and pause, just as pulling out of the different treaties do in terms of what keeps us all safe. So we were careful about it, but I'd point you to that sidebar on nuclear issues for how we tried to navigate that.
I'm assuming part of it is too, also as educators, you have to have a sort of a distance of impartiality, almost is the word I'm looking for. In other words, if you say he's an unstable dupe who'll kill us all, then what do you do next year when it's time it dulls your message for the rest of time because you've kind of let all the cats out of the bag at that point. And I do think that as someone who's, I was in high school debate, and sometimes you need to sort of see the people you're arguing with and try to at least recognize what foothold they have, as opposed to just say, you're crazy and going to kill us, if that answers your question.
Yeah, and I think also that's not what people are looking for us to. Some people are, and they get mad when we don't. But actually, we're just always trying to point out what we think are the important issues, and you figure out the candidate that both fits that. But we do take a stand on alliances, global government, things that many find irrelevant. We think they're important, and we do think they keep them safe. It does help keep us safe, and so we spend a lot of time measuring against that and are trending towards creating new ones and effective ones.
Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Sorry,
oh, sorry.
I got the mic, so I'll quickly. Neil Steinberg, thank you for mentioning this event in your column. That's how I'm aware of it, and I enjoy your column very much. Question, if Ukraine falls and Russia starts moving in on a NATO country, will that trigger an emergency meeting with your colleagues to reconsider the positioning of the clock?
Yes.
Ukraine has already caused a few emergency meetings as it is.
I have to ask this. So let's say Ukraine falls, or Taiwan is invaded, missiles fly. Do you move the clock to midnight? I mean, is that something that you've planned for, or is it by then you're just like, okay, we're going to be 12:01? Or I mean, would you ever go to midnight? Is that, or does it not matter?
Yeah, I think we talked about it. We can't imagine being at midnight. Midnight is we're not setting the clock anymore. Yes, like as Daniel said, when we do call emergency meetings, unfortunately we do it more frequently than we'd like to, but we kind of assess the situation about whether this is something that requires an emergency setting of the clock. Yeah. And so yeah, if we did see Ukraine fall, and we did the more interesting interesting debate, I think, is, and we had it early on, is among some members of the Science and Security Board, is there was an early conversation of, is it more dangerous to continue this fight that we're in, rather than just let Russia take that part of Ukraine and kind of back off. And we do talk through what keeps us safe. And there was this real debate about lessons about nuclear weapons. Does it make it seem that using nuclear weapons or having nuclear weapons are a power tool? To what extent does it enable Russia to continue to move so that we'd have to meet him later on more forcefully? Those were some early day interesting conversations, and I think where the board came out on, which is that Russia winning in that contest in Ukraine, whatever winning meant, was actually more destabilizing to politics of the region and more dangerous. And so those are the kinds of conversations we had. But yeah, if to what you said, would it cause an emergency meeting? Yeah, it would.
I am also a reader, and that's why 15 of us are here from your column.
We should have just done a Q&A with Neil. What's the rest of this?
Was it worthy? Are you glad you came?
You bet.
Oh, good.
What sort of a factor in your consideration on the clock would overpopulation be? Because I know it's a factor in population migration, water shortages, et cetera.
Yeah, I can say the population question is fairly complicated. I mean, there are some people that worry about the opposite trend, which is that, projections are, in many countries, we're below replacement rate and populations are declining. And that can also end up being catastrophic for society. And so it's a very kind of complex situation, the population question. I think, I can't remember the exact time scale, but population is expected to peak and then kind of steady and maybe decline in the coming, some number of decades. So the kind of traditional population problem where it's just going to grow without bound and we won't be able to feed everyone is less of an immediate concern. But you're absolutely right that anything where you have limited resources or limited distribution of resources, and that can cause conflict. And conflict is, any conflict that can spiral out of control that's what we worry about. So for growing populations in certain areas, especially areas which will be which are either politically unstable or which, because of climate change, are expected to become more volatile, that's a big concern, and we talk about that a lot.
Next question, sir.
I'd like to get your reaction to the concerns that Suleiman raised in his book, The Coming Wave, on AI, if you had a chance to take a look at that, including the disintegration of the nation state, bioweapons, and a number of other issues.
Excuse me. On all right now, where my sense of where our Science and Security Board is, and again, you can look at who's on it. You can go on our website and transparent about it. They haven't yet seen where we are right now as the tipping point of this being kind of an existential threat, and all of those things that he writes about kind of happening, they're all possible. So and we have this other report coming out on pathogens and pathogen research, and AI and biosecurity are really kind of, that's an area that everyone's looking at first and foremost as an area of overlap and all the negative that it can, and even there, and we got a briefing at the board about how easy it is to manufacture new pathogens, but even as they look into it, they're not yet seeing that it may accelerate things, but that it's fundamentally different in terms of what humans are kind of capable of doing, that we can use the AI, at least our board, that it's still a tool, and it's a tool that's going to be great good and great risk, but we can still manage it, and the worst kind of apocalyptic possibilities are still in our future. They're still out there. They could happen, they might happen, but they're not yet seeing it as happening, as some people are seeing them. But this is where our board is. They're not yet seeing that kind of existential threat. And the collapse of the nation state is pretty resilient and fights pretty hard. And we're not seeing that yet. It could happen that way. And there's a lot of things that could happen that we take very seriously. So what I have some optimism around is I think the speed at which the United States, the EU, the UN, and others are responding actually to begin to create norms, rules, and regulations around it is quite remarkable. Has a long way to go, but we've just seen the standing up of groups and within these institutions to try to figure out how to control them. And we've seen in the private sector something that I find quite fascinating. It's very easy to say AI will never be managed because it comes out of the private sector and it's too diffuse. And yet, some of the leaders that I find quite interesting are saying, no, there are pinch points. There are resources that you need to put into create the AI, and you can sanction them and you can control them and you can monitor. It's just we have to think differently about how we do this. So there are people that are optimistic out there about how to control it. So I think where our folks are is that all of these are possible and we need to be aware of it. But this is why it's like, this is right now the Oppenheimer moment for AI. These ideas on how you regulate it, how you manage it, how you avoid a situation like an economist who was speaking on this at the Council on Foreign Relations recently was saying, they're going to take all of our jobs, and so there's going to be less employment, and he's really concerned about that. But then it becomes this kind of fascinating, so what's the tax structure look like if you're really concerned about that? How do you distribute wealth? That's what it really becomes. Can we build those, begin to build towards that, so when the decision makers start to panic, we have things ready. They're shovel ready, if you will. We have been working on it for years with ideas about it. So my view isn't as apocalyptic, which is like great for me to say because I can so rarely say that, but it's not as apocryphal, if you will, as he laid out in that book. But I do think that is a possible future that we should take really seriously and begin building.
Actually, Dr. Bronson, what you said was there is a pessimistic thing in there that I pulled out, which is you mentioned the distribution of nuclear weapons, after Oppenheimer, and my first thought was, well, but of course they were distributed. Other countries got them. They did spread, but they were limited by the complexity and the difficulty of building an atomic bomb. If everyone could do it, then we'd already be gone. But with AI, everyone can do it. And that's something which makes it, in a way, more dangerous.
Not quite. I mean, so yes, everyone. So yes, of course, yes, it is very, very different. It's not as centralized from the state, but the amount of power that's required to do some of the kind of worst things is massive. You need these massive fields around it, and so how do you begin to limit that? So over decades, we began to learn how to track nuclear material, and we began to build these verification systems that were very important. We have people right now thinking about that in the AI space. It's different, it's harder, it's complicated, but they're already beginning to come up with ways to do that. And that's, to me, that's what I find the most interesting. That's what I want to understand better, because it's so easy, I think, to be like, there's nothing we're going to be able to do to stop it. And that's where Jeffrey Hinton is. Yeah. But not everybody's there. And I'll stop here, but it's the part where the movie Oppenheimer ends. I was just writing on this today. Oppenheimer ends, and he's devastated. He's distraught. The scientists have lost the narrative. The political leaders are now going to take the nuclear weapons, and they're going to make nuclear risk worse, which they actually do. And he's a broken man, and his security clearances are stripped. And that's where it ends, and we all walk out of the movie. We're like, ugh, right? But that's not where the story ends. In fact, Oppenheimer, he invests in places like the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and Federation of American Scientists and Pugwash. He builds these things. And Hans Bethe, who we see in the movie, he becomes the next chair of the Bulletin. And they begin to invest in organizations that 20 years later become the progenitor of new ideas of arms control. And it takes decades. And do we have that much time? They don't stop. They're really invested in this, and they create the environment where we get the ideas that help prevent us from this nuclear Armageddon, as dangerous as it is. And they could have done more, but they don't give up. They lean in, and that's kind of the moment I think that we're in.
We're nearing the end, which is fitting. Any final questions? Just
Do you take those?
Hi. Neil, thank you for the article. That's how I got here, too. I like the part that said it's free, too. So I said,
they didn't charge you, right?
I'm interested in knowing about the process. I only know about the announcement each year, like most people. It makes the paper, like once or 2, 3 days. It's a cycle, and it's gone for the year. So what is the process? Tell me succinctly your membership. Who are your experts? How do you give information, if you give, and how you receive from others? And then do you have a weekend where you deliberate, perhaps, and have your verdict, so to speak, process?
Yeah, so we have experts, a range of experts, some on nuclear or nuclear policy, climate change, disruptive technology, so the bio threats, cyber threats, including AI. There's a whole range of experts, and we meet semi-regularly. We have 2 kind of big in-person meetings a year, and then we meet additionally as needed, and then we have subgroups. Like there's a nuclear subgroup. The nuclear subgroup meets more frequently, and they kind of, over the course of the year, are constantly making an assessment. How are things going? Are things getting better or worse? What are the points of concern? What are the points of hope? And they kind of summarize that, and then there are a bunch of different groups. They all summarize. Then we all get together. We synthesize that, and it's 2 or 3 days where we kind of hash it out and see if we can come to consensus.
Here in Chicago.
Here in Chicago. And so, what happens every time is we get to a consensus where it's not always smooth. I mean, there are times where we really have to, people feel very strongly one way or the other. No, here's the nuclear thing, and that should really take precedence this year. And the biologists are like, no, there are pandemics too. We have to, and we have to kind of work it out, and we do. And people, these are all experts. They really care. But it's we all. It's not a very joyful thing to be setting the Doomsday Clock, especially lately, but it's fascinating. And being in this room with all these people who really, they've spent all this time kind of developing a deep understanding of whatever the subject matter is, and then you get to hear how they think about it, how they interpret the current events, where they think things are going to go. I mean, it's really fascinating. And so I think, I feel, good. You should read the document. You can see who's on the board on the website, and the document, we spend a lot of time on those documents, those few sentences that Rachel alluded to about the joint, the chairman of the joint of the, those took us, that was real work. But at the end, this is our document, and we really stand by it.
Dr. Bronson, any parting thoughts? We're near the end, and anything you want to leave us with? Any thoughts? Oh, no more questions?
No.
Hi. Hi. I have a philosophical question, and it can be fairly quick. It's open-ended. So you said that the Doomsday Clock isn't just a metaphor. You really stand by setting it at 90 seconds to midnight. And so I Googled this, and it's never been set further back than 17 minutes to midnight. So I was wondering if you could tell me, what does a world at 10 p.m. look like?
Well, we definitely talk about that, and when I started at the Bulletin, my husband was like, "Don't you have like daylight savings time? Can't you like knock it back an hour?" So it's an absolutely fair question. So look, the Doomsday Clock was set by an artist in 1947 at 7 minutes to midnight. And she set it at 7, at Marta Langsdorff, Chicago-based oil landscape painter, right? She was very prominent, married to a Manhattan Project scientist, Alexander Langsdorff. And so she understood, and basically she creates the clock because they need a cover for the magazine, the first cover of the first magazine, and she needs to, so she draws something that she thinks conveys what she knows her husband and his colleagues, what feels scary, what conveys their concerns. And to her, she says, I set it at 7 minutes to midnight because it was pleasing to my eye. That simple. She was an artist, and 7 minutes to her conveyed the feelings and the concerns of her husband and his colleagues. And that's what this Doomsday Clock. So we start at 7. It would have been a whole lot easier to start at 11, but we're at 7 minutes to midnight. And so there's something very positive about it, right? There's a sense that it's ticking, but the whole message is clearly we can move it back. And I think that's what also the power of it, that we can move it back. And so it's at 7 minutes to midnight, and then 2 years later, so 1947, now they're using the clock every issue because it's cheap, and all they have to do is change the color, and her kids are picking the colors that please their eyes. And 2 years later, when the Soviets explode their atom bomb, the editor moves it to 3 minutes to midnight, and then we get the testing of the hydrogen bombs. It gets moved to 2 minutes. So suddenly a static representation becomes dynamic. And so we are bounded by where we started. And now at the end of the Cold War in 1991, which is what you saw, it gets pushed back to 17 minutes to midnight. I think it's an excellent question of what we think about, of what would an hour before midnight look like, 30 minutes to midnight. And I think we would imagine a world where we have a much better, first of all, grasp on the global governance of technologies that have global implications, and that they would be regulated. I think we would be looking for a respect for science and expertise. That is something that we stand by. I think if we saw big breakthroughs, certainly in nuclear, but climate, if suddenly, like what Daniel, and imagining, we were talking about the ability to suck the carbon out of the atmosphere, those are things that would move the clock back. And so just as we've been imagining Armageddon and the apocalypse, I think it would be very helpful to also imagine what is Eden and Nirvana and, a much more what does that look like? And that's the part that, whether it's 10 minutes to midnight or even getting at this point to 3 minutes back to 5 minutes back to 7 minutes, in my mind, what it looks like is a world where we're walking around and we don't feel like it is all on the knife's edge and going in the wrong direction with the technologies of our own making, which is where I think that our board, that's something we walk around with regularly. It is not going in the right direction. We are not managing it responsibly.
Yeah, I'd like to, so I really think this is a critical question. And so, for example, in the Are We Doomed class, this week, the topic is utopias and dystopias. And the utopia part is critical. Like, there has to be this vision of what would it look like if the clock were way, turned way back. And I think, many scientists and many people in this space do have this vision. There's this sense that we're at this critical moment in history. We've developed these technologies. We're changing our planet. They're potentially incredibly destructive, but they're also incredibly powerful. And what's happening is society is kind of learning to deal with them. And if we do that successfully, we can kind of go into this golden age. And, a lot of people talk about that. We just have to kind of get through this period. And if we manage to get through without blowing ourselves up, we can end up being in an area where everyone prospers, the standard of living for across the globe goes up. We have, basically free energy because renewables, you just put it out, the sunlight is free, and you can have this really,
I mean, to cut you off, but we are out of time. But I'm so glad you asked that. It's such a perfect question to end at. To me, 10 o'clock is where these things we were talking about would be unimaginable. We would have spent the past 90 minutes talking about how to get people to floss more. In other words, and I think that the beauty of that question is while these are technological issues that we might, never figure out, the getting closer to a shared humanity where we care of other people, where we're not going to blow up some other nation because we want to say they belong to us, where there's, those are things that are possible, and those are things I think that leaving here we can all do in our own lives. We can be better husbands and wives and children, and be more closer to people and have the kind of human bonds that we wish everyone else had. Be sort of the revolution ourselves. And I think that's something that's in our capacity, and that's a great thing to keep in mind. I want to thank Rachel and Daniel for coming and spending time. I want to thank all of you for coming out to discuss what in some ways can be seen as a grim topic, but is also in a way something that's an encouraging topic. And those who are readers of the paper, thank you for reading and staying with us. It's an exciting time, and we're very happy that we've evaded our own doom and that we can come and be with you. So thank you all for coming tonight, and good night.